Hi, I'm Shelley Young, owner of the Chopping Block, and today I'm going to teach you how to cook and work with kale. I selected 3 very common varieties we find at the grocery stores today. Kale is very popular, so it's easy to find more varieties than we used to. This particular variety here is the regular scotch kale. Red kale, you got a nice red vein in here, little red tips, very pretty. This can also be even redder than that and even purple sometimes. And this is a Tuscan kale, which you'll find readily available at the grocery stores as well. This is a little meatier than these varieties here. And a little bit sweeter as well. These might be just a little bit more bitter when you're looking at different varieties. And I work with them a little bit different. The Tuscan kale is a little firmer texture, and it doesn't break down quite as much as the curly kale. So today I'm going to show you 2 recipes. One is how to saute kale, which I'm going to use the Tuscan kale for that. And we're going to make some kale chips with our red kale, actually. So for our kale chips, I've rinsed the kale. And what I want to do next is I'm going to make sure that's nice and dry. That's a critical piece of making the kale chips. If they're wet at all, they tend not to crisp up as nicely. So what I'm going to do here is just pull the kale away from the hard stem into pieces, put them in the salad spinner, and I'm going to spin them in the salad spinner and then put them out on a sheet pan just to make sure they're ultra dry. A good environment to let them dry out in is actually your refrigerator. So for our Tuscan kale, I'm going to really treat this the same way we did the Scotch kale, and that is to remove this hard rib. Our Tuscan kale that we're going to saute has a central ingredient in this recipe, very simply garlic, and lots of it. We're going to use 4 to 6 cloves. I'm going to peel these and slice these thin, and I'm going to saute them on a medium heat. About 4 tablespoons of olive oil. We're going to just lightly brown them. Be careful not to get them too dark. And then we're going to remove them from the oil. Now we're going to go ahead and put our kale in here. This may spatter, so be careful. There's a lot of water on here. There's a little bit of red chili flake. You can leave that out if you choose. But what I'm going to do is actually scoot the kale over a little bit and put a smidge down there, really to your taste. Depends a little bit on the pepper. About a ½ teaspoon here. Then we're just going to fold this over. All that water that was on the kale and that's coming out of the kale as it cooks down is what's going to steam this. So as soon as I see the kale wilt like this, it's really done. I like to have a little texture in the kale leaf. It also keeps it from getting too bitter. The longer you cook this, the more bitter it's going to become. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to fold that garlic back in the dish. And I'm going to season it with some salt. Note, one of the things that really tempers bitterness is salt. So if you find this a little strong, the bitter flavor, try adding a little bit more salt. So amazing how much a refrigerator dries things out. These are nice and dry, and I know that seems a little bit funny considering I dried all of these very carefully, and now I'm going to add liquid to them. But that's how we season the chips, so we want to make sure to not skip this drying step, even though you're going to add moisture to the chips. Now, we're doing a little Asian style today, so I'm going to add some olive oil. We're going to add a couple tablespoons of olive oil. We're going to add a teaspoon of soy sauce. Teaspoon of sesame oil. And sesame seeds. I don't know how much that is. A couple teaspoons. just so they're lightly coated. I'm going to toss these so they're nice and coated, and then I'm going to put them back out on sheet pans. So I've laid all of the seasoned kale out on to the sheet pans. I dried them on. These have a cooling rack on them as well. You can use parchment paper, but the cooling rack gives you a nice circulation around the kale, so they'll crisp up a little bit nicer. And I'm putting a little fine sea salt on these rather than just tossing it. It allows me to make sure that I get a little salt on every one and distribute it evenly. We're going to pop this in the oven at 350 degrees for about 10 minutes. We'll check them in about 5. So let's check our kale chips. What I'm really looking for is that they're relatively stiff, but you don't want to overcook. Like, this is a great one. This one is done. It's nice and stiff. But there are a few that just need to go for a second longer, so I'm going to pop them in for another minute. So I'm pulling my crispy kale chips off of the sheet pan. I'm using my fingers because these are so delicate. If I use a tong, it'll break them apart. And those are beautifully light and crispy. We have our gorgeous sautéed Tuscan kale, and that is 2 ways to cook kale.